The night the world forgot is the night that haunts the soil of this plantation even now. Imagine a place where the clock holds no meaning, where the air is thick with whispers that never reach the light of day. One night, centuries ago, every woman on this land gave birth, simultaneously, impossibly, unnaturally. No midwives recorded it. No priest sanctioned it. And yet, the children emerged, one after another, as though the land itself demanded their arrival. What kind of force orchestrates such a precise, coordinated event? And why would those in power ensure that every detail was buried, erased from records, censored from memory? This isn't a tale of coincidence. It is a deliberate, meticulously engineered phenomenon. Some call it a miracle, others, a curse. But I assure you, it is neither divine nor accidental. It is the evidence of a system, older than any government, older than any written law, that exercises control over life itself. The people who controlled this plantation understood something most of humanity never sees, that power is not given, it is inherited, cultivated, and imposed at birth. And in that night, the birth of every child became an act of ownership, a ritual of domination, a demonstration that some secrets are too dangerous to whisper aloud. You, the viewer, are about to learn what generations were forbidden to know. The plantation soil is more than earth. It is a ledger of human manipulation, soaked in fear, soaked in obedience, soaked in the silent screams of those who bore these children. Each life born that night carried a mark, a hidden signature, a testament that even the smallest among us can be ensnared by forces far beyond comprehension. Do not mistake this as folklore. This is a warning. There are threads that run from that night straight into the heart of our society today. Institutions, families, governments, they all carry echoes of the control first etched into that plantation's darkness. And once you see these threads, once you understand how they operate beneath the surface, nothing will ever feel ordinary again. Nothing will feel safe. The question now is simple. Can you look at the world and see the systems that are invisible, the manipulations that are untouchable, the rituals hidden in plain sight? Or will you remain blind, like everyone else, never realizing that your very life may already be a product of forces you cannot name, forces you cannot resist, forces older and darker than history itself? To understand how every woman gave birth on the same night, you must first understand how control actually works. Not with chains, not with violence alone. Those are crude tools. True control is psychological. It begins years before a single contraction, long before the body ever responds. On this plantation, obedience was cultivated slowly, patiently, the way one trains an animal not to notice the fence. The women were conditioned to move, eat, sleep, and bleed on rhythms that were not their own. Cycles were tracked. Emotions were regulated. Fear was introduced in measured doses, never enough to provoke rebellion, always enough to enforce compliance. The overseers did not speak of pregnancy as chance. They spoke of it as timing, as alignment, as harvest. Sight and foods were given only at specific seasons. Sight and herbs were withheld, then quietly reintroduced. The women were separated from one another just enough to prevent shared resistance, yet kept close enough to absorb collective suggestion. When one woman felt pain, the others felt it too. When one feared, fear spread like smoke through dry wood. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was experimentation, refinement, proof that human biology could be synchronized if the mind was shaped correctly. Records from nearby towns mention something strange in the months leading up to that night. An unusual silence from the plantation. Fewer deliveries, fewer deaths, fewer illnesses. Outsiders assumed prosperity. In reality, it was containment. The women were being prepared for a single moment, one window of time where the plantation's owners intended to demonstrate absolute authority over life itself. Not over land, not over labor, over birth, over origin, over the very starting line of human existence. On that night, no bells were rung, no alarms were raised. The women began labor almost calmly, as if responding to an internal command. Some later claimed they felt a pressure in the air, a low vibration that made resistance feel impossible. Others said they dreamed the same dream in the hours before, a voice telling them it was time, that the land was ready, that refusal was no longer an option. Whether chemical, psychological, or something far older, the mechanism worked. And when the first child cried, the others followed in waves, like a signal passing through flesh. Birth after birth. No chaos. No panic. Only inevitability. This is the part history avoids because it reveals a truth too uncomfortable to face. Humans can be synchronized, controlled, timed. If it could be done then, ask yourself what might be possible now, with tools far more sophisticated, far less visible, and far more deeply embedded in your daily life. You are not listening to a story about the past. You are being shown a prototype. What followed the births is where the silence becomes deliberate. Children were not celebrated. They were catalogued. We know this because fragments survived, ledges disguised as agricultural inventories, baptismal records with names missing but numbers intact, margins filled with symbols that did not belong to any church. Each child born that night was marked, not on the skin, but in placement, in upbringing, in isolation. They were separated almost immediately, distributed across quarters not by family, but by observed traits. Calm infants together, restless ones alone. Those who did not cry were noted with special interest. This was not parenting. It was sorting. The plantation owners believed that when birth is synchronized, development can be shaped more efficiently. They believed that shared origin creates shared susceptibility, that trauma, introduced at the same developmental window, produces predictable outcomes. Fear, when timed correctly, hardens some and breaks others. Loyalty, when introduced early, feels like instinct rather than obedience. The children were exposed to the same sounds at night, the same rhythms of labor during the day, the same controlled absences of affection. No one called it abuse. It was described as order. As the children grew, something unsettled even the overseers. The children displayed an unnatural awareness of one another. They finished each other's sentences. They woke at the same hour. When one fell ill, others reported pain without cause. This frightened the men who believed they were in control. So the experiment shifted. Bonds were severed. Distances increased. Some children were sold. Others disappeared into institutions under false names. The plantation's records thin out rapidly after this point, as if someone realized they had gone too far. But the damage, or the success, was already complete. Years later, towns reported an unusual concentration of influence traced back to individuals born within a narrow window. Men who rose quickly. Men who obeyed authority without question, or replaced it without remorse. Patterns emerged that could not be explained by education or chance. The plantation was no longer just land. It had become a factory of temperament, a proof of concept that human nature could be engineered under the right conditions. This is where you must slow down and listen carefully, because the purpose was never the children themselves. It was the data, the confirmation that identity is not sacred, that personality is malleable, that if you control the moment of origin, you can guide the trajectory of an entire life without ever touching it again. Modern institutions learned from this, even if they deny it. Birth records, developmental benchmarks, standardized milestones. These are not neutral tools. They are refinements of an older understanding. The plantation was erased, the land sold, the buildings burned. But the knowledge extracted from that night did not dissipate. It migrated. And if you feel, even now, that parts of your life were decided before you ever chose them, this is why. At this point, most men instinctively resist what they are hearing. That resistance is not yours. It was installed. You were taught to believe that history is chaotic, that outcomes are random, that power reacts instead of plans. That belief keeps you passive. The truth is colder. Power designs environments, then lets people think they are choosing freely inside them. The plantation was one such environment, stripped of all pretense, where the architects of control did not bother hiding their methods. After the children were dispersed, the women were silenced in a more permanent way. Some were relocated under new identities. Others were institutionalized, labeled unstable for insisting something unnatural had been done to them. A few vanished entirely. Their testimonies, when they exist at all, are fragmented, half-remembered sensations, recurring nightmares, an unshakable belief that the night of the births was rehearsed long before it happened. That belief alone was enough to discredit them. Society has always had a convenient name for women who remember too much. The plantation's investors, however, were meticulous. Correspondence between estates reveals discussions about scalability. Could synchronized birth be replicated elsewhere? Could entire regions be timed? Not just plantations. The language becomes clinical. Fertility is a variable. Emotion as a lever. Faith as a delivery system. They understood something modern psychology would later rediscover. Belief alters biology. If enough people expect the same outcome, the body often complies. The women were not forced into labor. They were guided into it. Here is where the narrative turns dangerous, because it implicates more than a handful of long-dead elites. The plantation served as a bridge between old-world ritual and modern systems. Before laboratories, before pharmaceuticals, there were controlled diets, stress cycles, isolation, suggestion, and myth. These tools did not vanish. They were sanitized, renamed, institutionalized. What was once called ritual is now called protocol. What was once enforced by overseers is now reinforced by culture. You may think this has nothing to do with you. That is the final layer of the mechanism. Men who believe they are exempt from influence are the easiest to influence of all. The plantation proves that control does not require constant supervision, only a precise beginning. If identity can be shaped at birth, then obedience can be disguised as personality, and submission can feel like destiny. This is why certain truths are ridiculed rather than debated. Laughter is cheaper than censorship and more effective. If the public ever accepted that human development can be coordinated on a mass scale, trust in institutions would collapse overnight. So the story is framed as myth. Folklore, a curiosity. But myths exist to hide facts that are too powerful to present openly. You are still here because some part of you recognizes the pattern. And that recognition is the first crack in the structure that was built around you. There's a reason the plantation's location was never marked on official maps. Not erased, never marked to begin with. Power prefers absence over denial. If something does not exist on paper, it cannot be investigated, cannot be subpoenaed, cannot be remembered. Yet old trade routes bend unnaturally around that land, as if avoiding it. Property lines refuse to align. Even satellite imagery, in modern times, shows irregular interference over the region, dismissed as calibration error. The land resists observation. That alone should tell you something. Local folklore, passed quietly from father to son, speaks of men who refused to sleep on that soil. They claimed the ground pulsed at night, not audibly, but internally, felt in the chest rather than the ears. Animals miscarried there at abnormal rates. Crops grew thick but tasteless, as if optimized for yield rather than nourishment. These details never made it into official reports because they were not useful to those cataloging outcomes. The plantation was never about prosperity. It was about predictability. The men who financed it were not mystics, despite what some would like to believe. They were pragmatists, early industrialists, political intermediaries, men who understood that controlling labor was temporary, but controlling lineage was permanent. If you shape the conditions under which people are born, you don't need to manage them later. They will manage themselves, according to the template you installed. This is the logic that terrified church authorities when rumors began to surface. It implied that souls were not sovereign, that faith itself could be engineered. So the church responded the only way institutions ever do when faced with a truth that threatens their authority. They absorbed it. Site and rituals were subtly modified, calendars adjusted, feast days aligned with biological cycles under the guise of tradition. Publicly, they condemned the plantation as heretical. Privately, they studied it. The most effective systems do not compete, they merge. What happened on that night was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration. A signal sent upward through layers of power that said, "This works." And once something works, it is never abandoned. It is refined, hidden behind better language, distributed across systems so no single hand appears responsible. Education, medicine, religion, media, each took a piece of the insight and claimed neutrality. If you feel a growing unease, that is appropriate. Unease is what happens when a man realizes the world is more intentional than he was taught to believe. The plantation strips away the comforting illusion of randomness. It suggests that many of the pressures you felt, expectations, impulses, limits, may not be personal failures, but inherited constraints. And once you see that, the question is no longer who controlled them. The question becomes whether you are still being controlled now, by systems so normalized you no longer recognize them as cages. The most disturbing element is not what the plantation did, but how quickly its logic spread without resistance. Once the idea took root that human development could be engineered quietly, Without visible force, it appealed to every institution obsessed with stability. Revolutions are messy. Armies are expensive. But shaping people before they know who they are, that is efficient. That is clean. That is nearly invisible. Surviving correspondence from adjacent estates reveals imitation attempts, failed ones. Births clustered but did not align. Children showed no cohesion. The conclusion was blunt: synchronization requires more than timing. It requires belief saturation. The women on the original plantation were not just controlled physically. They were immersed in a closed reality. No alternative narratives. No competing explanations. Their world was a sealed chamber, where suggestion echoed until it became truth. This is why the event could not be replicated easily. Most populations were too porous, too exposed to contradiction. This insight would later become foundational. You see it echoed in how modern societies manage information. Fragment truth. Flood attention. Prevent coherence. The plantation succeeded because coherence was total. Every signal reinforced every other signal. There was no escape from the narrative. And when the body is trapped inside a single story long enough, it begins to obey it. What frightens historians who stumble too close to this subject is the implication that free will is not erased. It is redirected. The women chose to comply because resistance had been reframed as danger, as isolation, as moral failure. They were not beaten into submission that night. They walked into it. That distinction matters. It is the difference between tyranny and consent engineering. The children, too, were not forced into their trajectories. They gravitated toward them. When given choices, they chose what felt familiar. Authority felt comforting. Hierarchy felt natural. Disobedience felt wrong in a way they could never articulate. This is how systems perpetuate themselves without visible enforcement. They produce people who defend the structure that shaped them. If you are paying attention, you should feel the mirror turning toward you. Because the plantation did not invent these techniques. It concentrated them. It proved them. And once proven, they became too valuable to discard. They simply moved out of the shadows and into policies, standards, norms. What was once an experiment became a blueprint. This is why certain questions are discouraged, not forbidden. Why curiosity is tolerated until it threatens coherence. Why men who seek patterns instead of anecdotes are labeled paranoid or extreme. Labels are tools. They collapse complex inquiry into something easily dismissed. The plantation's true legacy is not the children born that night. It is the method by which reality itself can be shaped without ever appearing controlled. And if you are wondering why this knowledge feels heavy, why it feels like it carries weight beyond information, it is because awareness disrupts conditioning. The system does not fear rebellion. It fears recognition. Recognition is dangerous because it bypasses fear and habit. The men who designed the plantation understood that controlling perception is more effective than controlling action. If a person believes they are free, they will willingly inhabit the cages built around them. If they are unaware of the patterns dictating their lives, they will defend those patterns as natural. That night, every woman's labor was synchronized not just by observation and timing, but by the subtle orchestration of belief. They were guided toward inevitability, and their bodies obeyed because the mind had no alternative. This principle, coordinated obedience through perception, is the hidden currency of power. It does not require swords, bills, or laws. It requires consistency, repetition, and the removal of alternatives. The plantation is a prototype of this model. Every element, from diet to rumor to ambient sound, was curated to ensure compliance. The night of births was not an accident. It was the apex of decades of conditioning. And yet, most historical accounts dismiss it as anecdotal, impossible, folkloric. That dismissal is not innocence. It is complicity. Power always ensures that the narrative conforms to the unthinking majority. Even the children, once dispersed, were subject to invisible scaffolds. They were nudged, not forced. Their aptitude, temperament, loyalty, and fear were recorded and reinforced with invisible signals. A glance, a word, a reward or denial, all engineered to confirm the system. This was a long-term experiment in behavior modification at its purest, most efficient form. No laboratory, no prison, no political campaign could achieve the same precision. The plantation succeeded because it leveraged human instinct, timing, and narrative simultaneously. You, the viewer, are already participating in similar systems. Education, media, corporate structures, digital environments, they all feed patterns, suggest inevitabilities, and reward conformity. Most men never recognize it because it feels natural. Familiarity is indistinguishable from control. The plantation shows that control does not require oppression. It requires architecture. Structures built carefully, imperceptibly, over years. And once the structure is internalized, rebellion seems foolish, even impossible. Halfway through this revelation, you must pause. If you are ready to cement understanding and begin internalizing awareness, type the phrase "I see the pattern" in the comments below. Then, type it again. Twice. This is not superstition. It is engagement. It is alignment. It signals to your mind and the algorithm that you are awake, that your attention is no longer passive, that you are claiming the first level of insight that separates observers from participants. Because from here, the descent grows darker, and the lessons you will encounter are no longer about history. They are about the mechanisms that shape every human society, including the one you inhabit today. The deeper you descend, the more the mechanics of control become clear. On the plantation, obedience was inseparable from identity. The women were not simply workers or mothers, they were instruments, calibrated for a single event. Their thoughts, their emotions, even the timing of their bodies were orchestrated with precision. Every moment of anticipation, every measured intervention, every whispered warning was a lever pulling the human machine toward one inevitable outcome. And when the night arrived, the result was so perfect it seemed supernatural, but it was purely engineered. This is the essence of hidden power, mastery over timing and perception. The plantation's architects understood a principle few admit openly. Control is most effective when the target believes they are acting freely. The women believed they were making natural choices. They believed labor was the product of divine or bodily will. But the truth was far more insidious. Their minds had been aligned over years to create a singular, synchronized moment of action. Resistance was theoretically possible, but psychologically improbable. The same force that synchronized births could, in theory, synchronize obedience, loyalty, and thought. And it didn't stop with birth. Each child was observed, categorized, and subtly molded. The records speak of natural tendencies and aptitude markers, but these were euphemisms. The real work was invisible: reinforcement, subtle conditioning, isolation of impulses that could disrupt the intended pattern. Even curiosity, that dangerous human trait, was monitored and suppressed. Those who demonstrated deviation were quietly redirected, removed, or broken. The system operated like a symphony, every human a note tuned to harmony or discord according to the conductor's plan. This is why the plantation matters today, not as a historical oddity, but as a blueprint. Modern institutions, consciously or not, use the same methods, though now cloaked in policy, education, social expectation, and media. The principle is identical: align perception, remove alternatives, and ensure that obedience appears natural. If you recognize the pattern, the unsettling realization comes quickly. You may already be a product of similar conditioning. Your preferences, your decisions, your desires, all may have been guided by forces you cannot name, forces that rely on subtle timing and psychological leverage rather than overt force. And now, the night's secret grows darker still. The synchronized births were only the beginning. They were a proof of concept, a demonstration that human life, in its earliest stage, could be orchestrated and categorized. Those who designed the plantation learned more than just control over bodies. They learned control over futures, over potential, over identity itself. And that is a lesson every institution since is quietly integrated, often without acknowledgement, always without oversight. What you are feeling now, unease, disbelief, fascination, is the first crack in the illusion. That crack can widen if you choose to see beyond it. You are standing on the edge of knowledge most people never touch. And once you step fully into it, the world you thought you knew will never feel safe or ordinary again. Once the plantation proved its premise, the question for those in power was not whether to continue, but how to disperse the knowledge without exposing its origin. Centralized control is fragile. Distributed influence is resilient. So the methods were broken apart, fragmented, and embedded across systems that appeared unrelated. Medicine adopted timing. Education adopted standardization. Religion adopted rhythm. Governance adopted normalization. Each institution took a piece, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, that together they reconstructed the same architecture that once operated openly on that land. This is how forbidden knowledge survives. It does not travel as doctrine. It travels as practice. No one needed to mention the plantation again. The lesson had already been absorbed. Shape the environment early, and behavior will regulate itself later. The plantation's true success was not the synchronized births. It was the realization that human beings are most malleable when they believe they are protected, guided, or improved. The children born that night became living proof. Some rose into positions of quiet authority. Others became enforcers of order, not through violence, but through compliance. A few rejected the structure entirely, and those are the ones history loses. Their records end abruptly. Their names vanish. Resistance, when it emerges from within a system like this, is treated not as dissent, but as malfunction. Pay attention to that word, malfunction. It implies design. The plantation revealed that when enough variables are controlled, deviation looks less like rebellion and more like error. This framing is now everywhere. Those who do not conform are not argued with. They are diagnosed, marginalized, or corrected. The system no longer asks, are they right? It asks, why are they not functioning as expected? You were raised inside this logic. Everyone was. From the moment you entered structured time, bells, schedules, grades, milestones, you were being synchronized with millions of others. Not to the same night, perhaps, but to the same expectations. The same emotional responses. The same definitions of success and failure. The plantation was crude compared to what followed. It required isolation and secrecy. Modern systems require neither. They operate in plain sight, defended by the very people they shape. This is why the story feels heavy. It threatens a foundational belief that you are the sole author of your trajectory. The truth is more complex. You are an author, yes, but many chapters were outlined before you learned to read. And the earlier the outline, the harder it is to revise. The plantation whispers a final warning from the past. If control can be inherited, then freedom must be consciously reclaimed. And reclamation begins with understanding the architecture you were born into, before it finishes deciding who you are allowed to become. By now, you should sense the subtle terror underlying the plantation's legacy. It was not just a land of labor, of crops, or of profits. It was a laboratory of identity. Every human there, woman, child, overseer, was a variable in an experiment designed to prove a single truth. When you control the conditions of birth, you can control the arc of a life. And when you control enough lives, you control society itself. This principle is uncomfortable because it forces recognition that freedom is often a veneer, obedience a product, and rebellion an exception, not the norm. Consider the tools used: timing, isolation, suggestion, repetition, and selective reinforcement. These are not unique to the plantation. They exist wherever people believe they are free but are in fact guided by unseen currents. Schools, families, organizations, governments, even faith-based communities, they all refine the same techniques, calibrated to feel invisible. You obey without thinking, because the signals around you have been optimized for decades, centuries even, to ensure predictability. The plantation proves that compliance is more reliably manufactured before birth than after. And yet, most modern observers miss this. They interpret history as chaos, random events, unpredictable outcomes. But chaos is a cover story. The plantation demonstrates that outcomes can be meticulously choreographed, even when the surface appears spontaneous. Every ritual, every instruction, every whispered story reinforced alignment. Even minor deviations were treated as anomalies to be corrected or erased. Control, once perfected, operates quietly. It does not need spectacle. It only requires consistency. The women, the children, the overseers, they were all complicit, willingly or unwillingly, in a system that erased autonomy without ever appearing coercive. And this is where it becomes deeply personal for you. Because the same patterns echo in your world today. Small choices, guided by larger systems, accumulate to produce conformity. You think you act independently, but the plantation reminds us that independence is only genuine when the environment that shaped us is recognized and understood. Now, as you listen, you are being asked to question instinctively every belief about what you are capable of, Every assumption about what is natural must be weighed against the possibility that it was orchestrated before you were even aware. This is the weight of recognition. It is the knowledge that power is patient, subtle, and relentless, and that recognition alone can begin to free you. The next sections will delve deeper into the hidden agendas of those who refined these methods after the plantation, exposing networks, psychological systems, and deliberate manipulations that persist in society today. After the plantation was dismantled, the men who carried its lessons did not disappear into obscurity. They moved upward, sideways, inward. They embedded themselves in councils, trusts, academic circles, and advisory bodies that never made headlines. Power rarely seeks the spotlight when it understands leverage. These men learned to speak the language of benevolence while thinking in terms of control. Publicly, they discussed progress. Privately, they discussed predictability. What they carried with them was not guilt. It was confidence. Confidence that human behavior could be mapped, influenced, and nudged without ever appearing directed. The plantation had proven that when enough variables are aligned early, outcomes cease to be surprising. This insight reshaped how institutions approached human development. Childhood became a window. Adolescence became a corridor. Adulthood became a maintenance phase. The goal was no longer to dominate openly, but to stabilize quietly. Psychological frameworks began to emerge that echoed plantation logic almost verbatim, though stripped of its uglier origins. Terms like normalization, adjustment, and socialization replaced obedience. Conditioning was rebranded as education. Compliance was reframed as cooperation. The violence of the past was replaced by incentives, metrics, and reputational pressure. People were no longer forced to conform. They were rewarded for doing so, and punished indirectly when they did not. This shift made control nearly self-sustaining. Individuals began to police one another. Deviance became socially expensive. Curiosity was tolerated only within approved boundaries. The plantation had required overseers. The modern system does not. It relies on internalized surveillance, on the fear of exclusion, ridicule, or failure. This is more efficient than any chain or weapon. It transforms society into its own enforcer. What makes this especially dangerous is that it produces sincere belief. People defend the systems that shape them because those systems feel like common sense. Questioning them feels irrational, even immoral. This is the plantation's most enduring legacy. Not control imposed from above, but control defended from below. A population that equates conformity with virtue will never recognize its own captivity. You may notice this dynamic in your own life. Moments when speaking plainly felt risky. Times when silence seemed safer than honesty. Instances where you sensed a pattern but dismissed it to avoid conflict. These are not personal weaknesses. They are learned responses. The plantation taught power that shaping the internal compass of a human being is far more effective than commanding their actions. And once that compass is set, the system can step back. The individual will navigate themselves toward the destinations chosen for them long before they ever realized a map existed. The plantation's methodology was never about brute force. It was about subtle architecture. Every detail reinforced inevitability. The walls, the schedules, the sounds, the light. Everything was a vector of influence. Modern systems replicate this principle invisibly. Subtle cues, repeated exposure, and environmental pressure combine to guide choices without a single command. You are constantly in a space engineered to produce predictable responses. Every habit, every expectation, every cultural norm is a signal designed to channel behavior. Consider the children born on that night. They were assigned not only to specific caregivers but to specific rhythms of life. Some were kept awake at intervals. Others were lulled into precision sleep cycles. Sensory input was controlled, the temperature of rooms, the textures of fabrics, even the cadence of spoken words. The goal was total synchronization. Each child's emotional response was mapped, tested, and subtly corrected to reinforce uniformity. Over time, identity became inseparable from the system. Compliance became instinct. What is terrifying is how easily this principle can scale. One night, one plantation, hundreds of lives. Today, millions experience the same invisible orchestration without realizing it. Diet, education, social media, urban design. Each is calibrated to produce predictable patterns of thought, emotion, and decision-making. Most people believe these influences are incidental. They are not. They are deliberate. The plantation proved it centuries ago. Even perception itself can be engineered. Fear, desire, hope, and loyalty are all programmable when the system controls both the stimuli and the narrative around those stimuli. That is why the women believed labor was natural. That is why the children accepted their placements. That is why entire generations defend systems that limit their freedom while believing they chose them willingly. Synchronization is invisible because it feels voluntary. The most effective cages are the ones we never see. And you, listening now, are being asked to see it. To notice the invisible threads, the subtle levers, the orchestrations masquerading as choice. Recognition is the first act of freedom. Understanding the plantation is not just history, it is a lens. It allows you to see the structures designed to shape every human life, every community, every society. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The next stage is darker still, the hidden agendas embedded in the systems that evolved from this principle, the psychological operations disguised as education, morality, and governance. These are the forces that decide not only what people do, but who they believe themselves to be. The plantation was only the first layer. What followed was the invisible network, the distribution of knowledge into systems designed to operate independently yet harmoniously. Think of it as a silent relay. One institution handed lessons to the next, not as instruction but as protocol. Clergy adopted timing rituals. Schools adopted standardized assessment. Governments refined census and record-keeping. Each system reinforced the others without ever acknowledging the original source. The blueprint of control became diffuse, almost untraceable, yet unmistakably effective. The women's synchronized labor was the seed of a principle. Influence begins at origin and multiplies across networks. That principle survives today in ways most men never suspect. Behavioral norms, collective expectations, and even subtle cues of approval or shame operate like the same mechanisms used centuries ago. You may believe you act out of personal choice, but your responses are shaped by cues embedded deep within social and environmental systems. The plantation proved that outcomes can be preordained without force, provided the architecture of life is meticulously arranged. Even curiosity, the very trait that makes men question the world, was understood as a variable to be managed. In the plantation, curiosity could destabilize synchronization. Children who asked too many questions were subtly redirected. Adults who speculated too freely were marginalized or removed. This principle informs modern systems, controlled channels of inquiry, permitted dissent, and socially sanctioned curiosity create the illusion of freedom while reinforcing obedience. Ask too much, and the system labels you, isolates you, or absorbs you into predictable behavior. The risk is invisible until it is too late. Consider the invisible architecture of perception. When the body, mind, and environment are all aligned, resistance is not only difficult, it is unimaginable. The plantation proved this. The women felt they were acting freely. The children appeared autonomous. Yet the entire night was orchestrated with precision. This is a lesson applied everywhere today. The moment humans believe they are acting naturally, they are most vulnerable to manipulation. Power thrives in invisibility and consent. Now, you must understand the personal consequence. Awareness is dangerous. Once you see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. You begin to notice how much of your life, decisions, desires, fears, may have been preconditioned. And this is exactly why the plantation, and its modern echoes, remain unspoken. True power is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not need approval. It only requires patience, precision, and the patient manipulation of perception. The true power of the plantation lay not in the overt actions of its overseers, but in the invisible rituals that shaped every life within its walls. Small acts, repeated endlessly, created deep grooves in the mind. A glance at the wrong time, a word delivered with measured weight, a sound that cued fear or anticipation. These were the tools of orchestration. Every ritual reinforced the unspoken hierarchy: who obeys, who observes, and who is disposable. Nothing was left to chance. Even silence was intentional, a subtle reinforcement that attention itself is a form of control. The women were immersed in an environment that directed their physiology and psychology simultaneously. Timing, sensory input, and suggestion converged in ways that science would only begin to understand centuries later. The mind does not recognize subtle coercion as coercion. It registers it as natural rhythm. And once rhythm is internalized, obedience feels instinctive. What you call intuition may simply be an echo of the structures imposed upon you before you ever knew yourself. Children, too, were sculpted by these rituals. Lullabies, meals, whispers, and warnings were all vectors of alignment. Emotional responses were calibrated to reinforce group cohesion and compliance. Curiosity, independent thought, and empathy were carefully balanced against the system's need for predictability. Those who resisted were quietly marginalized, reassigned, or vanished from records. The plantation did not punish loudly. It punished invisibly. Fear, uncertainty, and isolation achieved more than chains ever could. These methods were replicated in smaller, subtler ways across society as the lessons spread. Education systems, religious practices, and social hierarchies all borrowed from the principle. Synchronized perception, reward compliance, and rendered deviation psychologically costly. Control no longer required visible authority. It became embedded in the everyday rhythms of life. Obedience was not enforced, it was absorbed. It became instinctive, normalized, and self-perpetuating. Understanding this is uncomfortable because it forces recognition that most systems you trust were never neutral. They are built upon the same architecture that orchestrated synchronized birth centuries ago. Rituals, repeated patterns, and subtle cues shape more than behavior. They shape identity. And identity is the currency of power. Once you grasp that, you realize that history is not just a story of events. It is a guidebook for those who understand how to manipulate human nature with precision, patience, and permanence. The weight of this knowledge is deliberate. It forces you to see beyond surface chaos to the quiet, relentless structures that shape lives from birth to death. And once you see them, you cannot ignore them. What makes these systems truly insidious is that their impact compounds over generations. The women of the plantation were only the first layer. Their children carried the imprints of synchronization, the echoes of carefully curated stress, expectation, and conditioning. By the time those children reached maturity, the subtle rhythms instilled in them had become internalized. Habits, instincts, and patterns that felt natural but were carefully engineered. Their minds had been trained to obey not out of fear, but because deviation felt unnatural. This is the hidden genius of the system, predictability disguised as autonomy. Those born under such influence are not simply compliant, they defend the very structures that control them. Authority becomes familiar, hierarchy feels inevitable, and resistance appears irrational. The plantation demonstrated that when manipulation begins early, the individual will not only conform but perpetuate the system voluntarily. This principle underpins countless modern institutions, where incentives, social pressure, and cultural norms align to produce predictable outcomes. Even today, you can observe the same mechanisms in operation. Peer pressure, conformity, and subtle emotional cues guide choices without anyone ever saying, "Do this." Social media algorithms, marketing, education, and political messaging all operate on the same principle. Engineer perception, reinforce behavior, and normalize compliance. People defend the system that shapes them because it feels natural. The pattern becomes invisible, and invisibility is the most potent form of power. The children of the plantation, deliberately dispersed, became instruments of subtle influence themselves. Some entered commerce, some law, some education. Each carried the lessons embedded during infancy: obedience, rhythm, predictability, and alignment with authority. They became proof that the methods worked, that identity can be steered at its inception, and that power can be inherited as easily as property. Understanding this shifts the perspective on human history. Many events that appear chaotic, accidental, or divine were, in fact, predictable consequences of long-term control systems. What feels like coincidence is often architecture. What feels like destiny may be design. And once this is understood, it changes the way you see yourself, your decisions, your impulses, your values. All may be influenced by patterns installed long before you could recognize them. This is the moment where realization turns into responsibility. Awareness alone does not free you. It is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy in a world built to obscure it. The plantation teaches a chilling lesson. Control is most absolute when it is invisible. Power need not be obvious to be effective. When every subtle cue, tone of voice, placement of objects, timed rituals, and orchestrated silence is aligned, Human behavior becomes predictable, almost mechanical. The women and children were not coerced in ways easily recognized. Their compliance was voluntary in appearance, instinctive in reality. The system proved that the most efficient domination occurs when resistance seems impossible, even before it is attempted. The brilliance of this approach is psychological. By shaping perception, the overseers removed the possibility of dissent. Fear alone was insufficient. It needed supplementation with anticipation, expectation, and normalized patterns. Even the children's instincts were preconditioned. Crying, sleep, curiosity, and attention were timed and monitored. The natural tendencies subtly redirected to serve a single purpose: synchronization. The human mind, when guided subtly over time, becomes complicit in its own manipulation. This principle, demonstrated so vividly on that plantation, extends far beyond its historical context. Modern societies operate under similar architectures. Education systems, corporate hierarchies, digital environments, and social norms all replicate the core mechanisms: subtle conditioning, reinforcement of expectations, and alignment of perception. Freedom is often an illusion. Compliance is internalized. The most powerful systems are the ones defended willingly by those they shape, because instinct tells us it is right, natural, and inevitable. Even now, the echoes of that night ripple through society. Patterns implanted in the first moments of life shape identity, choices, and behavior for decades. Small, imperceptible nudges, social cues, cultural expectations, metrics, and incentives guide behavior with astonishing precision. Those who recognize the architecture see that rebellion is rarely about courage. It is about awareness. Understanding the invisible scaffolding of influence is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy. You are at that threshold now. Recognition alone is dangerous. It awakens the mind to the subtle manipulations that govern almost every aspect of life. It exposes the illusion of choice, the carefully timed rhythms of obedience, and the invisible levers that decide what humans consider natural. And yet, this is only the beginning. To truly understand the plantation's legacy, you must confront the networks, the systemic manipulations, and the psychological strategies that extended its lessons far beyond the soil where it began. The descent deepens. What is coming next will reveal how the principles tested on that single night were refined into societal instruments that persist in shaping thought, identity, and desire today. The networks that emerged from the plantation were not conspiracies in the popular sense. They were systems, invisible, self-reinforcing, and adaptive. The men who mastered synchronized birth understood a principle that modern institutions still exploit. Control is strongest when it is decentralized yet coherent. Influence does not require a single hand guiding every action. It only requires alignment across multiple points, so that behavior follows the path of least resistance, as if by natural law. The plantation's lessons migrated into families, schools, religious institutions, and civic organizations. Timing, expectation, and subtle conditioning became embedded in every social rhythm. Rituals, habits, and schedules were not merely cultural. They were designed to produce predictable psychological outcomes. The most striking proof of this is how invisible it all becomes. Compliance no longer feels like submission. It feels instinctive, intuitive, almost inevitable. The plantation's methods were the prototype. Modern society perfected the application. Even those who resist are shaped. Patterns installed in early life create a default lens through which choices are interpreted. Curiosity is channeled, rebellion is managed, and conformity appears voluntary. The system does not punish openly. It rewards subtly and punishes indirectly. Attention, approval, status, and opportunity are distributed according to adherence to invisible rhythms. Deviation triggers isolation, doubt, and self-correction long before external force is applied. And yet, awareness can destabilize the structure. The moment you recognize the levers, the subtle cues, the rhythm that guides your instincts, you gain a form of power that is imperceptible to those still inside the system. Knowledge itself becomes a tool, a weapon, a means to navigate and, potentially, to escape manipulation. But this awareness carries a burden. Recognition alone is enough to isolate you from the unseeing majority. The price of insight is alienation. Here is the most dangerous truth. The architecture tested on that plantation did not vanish. It evolved. It became cleaner, subtler, and more widespread. Timing, suggestion, and alignment now operate through social norms, cultural expectations, and digital reinforcement. The human mind, once conditioned to rhythms of obedience at birth, continues to be nudged and synchronized, often without any conscious awareness. And the closer you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. You are never truly free unless you first see the forces that guide you. This is the threshold where knowledge becomes responsibility, and responsibility becomes action, or inaction that carries its own cost. The next revelations will expose the subtle mechanisms that perpetuate hierarchy, fear, and compliance across generations, and how the lessons of that night continue to ripple in society today. The plantation's influence extended far beyond its physical borders because it proved a chilling universal truth. Human behavior can be guided, even engineered, without chains or threats. Control is most efficient when it feels natural, when obedience is internalized as instinct rather than imposed as law. The women's synchronized labor was not a miracle. It was a demonstration of this principle. Once learned, it could be adapted, refined, and scaled. And scaled it was, in ways that are almost invisible to the casual observer. What you must grasp is that the mechanisms used there were subtle, persistent, and cumulative. Patterns of perception, cycles of expectation, and rhythms of fear or comfort were introduced incrementally, often over years. The human mind, once immersed in a structured environment, begins to obey without realizing it. Every action, every decision, every emotional response can be nudged in predictable ways when the environment is carefully curated. The plantation was proof that life itself can be shaped with precision. The children, dispersed into different families and quarters, were part of a long-term experiment. Each was observed for responsiveness, loyalty, and adaptability. Deviance was corrected quietly, almost imperceptibly, while compliance was reinforced, often with no visible reward or punishment. The system did not require coercion. Compliance became self-reinforcing. Over time, those born on that night demonstrated a shared instinct, alignment with authority, absorption of rules, and an almost preternatural ability to act predictably. Modern institutions exploit the same principle. Education systems, corporate hierarchies, digital algorithms, and social norms all guide behavior subtly, shaping perception and decision-making. Freedom, in this context, is conditional. It is the freedom to act within the constraints of an invisible architecture. The illusion of choice masks the reality of control. And like the children of the plantation, most people live their lives within patterns imposed long before they could recognize them. Now, you must see the pattern in your own life. Recognize the structures guiding your decisions, the rhythms shaping your attention, the narratives that define what you believe to be natural. Awareness is the first act of liberation, but it is also dangerous. The system will resist recognition. It will isolate you, challenge you, and attempt to pull you back into its orchestrated flow. The plantation proves that compliance can be cultivated silently, but once comprehension awakens, the stakes rise. Knowledge becomes responsibility. The descent deepens. The next truths will uncover how hierarchical control and psychological manipulation evolved from these early experiments, infiltrating institutions, networks, and even personal relationships to this very day. The plantation was, in essence, a microcosm of power distilled into a single night. But its lessons were never meant to remain there. The synchronized birth was not the conclusion. It was a proof of principle, a demonstration that identity, loyalty, and behavior could be patterned from the earliest possible moment. Those who understood this realized that obedience is most potent when it feels self-generated. Fear and coercion are crude, anticipation, expectation, and rhythm are surgical. And once internalized, the individual becomes an enforcer of the very system that shaped them. The children, having absorbed the rhythms of that night, were predisposed to function within hierarchical structures. They internalized authority as natural, predictability is desirable, and compliance is instinct. Deviation felt foreign, even threatening. And the beauty of the design was that it perpetuated itself. Those conditioned would condition others, voluntarily, without awareness of the system they were reinforcing. Influence becomes generational, invisible, and almost unstoppable. This principle extends far beyond any plantation. Modern governance, corporate systems, and social networks operate on the same logic. Timing, suggestion, repetition, and expectation are leveraged to align behavior. Standards are normalized, deviation penalized indirectly, and conformity rewarded subtly. Free will remains intact in appearance, yet is constrained by invisible structures. The closer you examine your life, the more you may recognize these patterns, how decisions, impulses, and beliefs can be quietly guided toward predictable outcomes. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Most humans defend the very structures that shape them. They see the constraints as natural, moral, or necessary. Hierarchies, rules, and expectations are internalized to the point where resistance seems irrational. The Plantation demonstrated that obedience is not a result of force, but of perception, alignment, and rhythm. The system works because those inside it defend it without realizing they are participating in the architecture of control. If you feel the weight of this knowledge, that is appropriate. Recognition is dangerous. It separates you from those who remain unaware, creating clarity and isolation. The moment you see the invisible levers operating around you, you cannot pretend ignorance. The system will attempt to pull you back, subtly, through habit, expectation, and social reinforcement. Understanding is not neutral. It is an act that challenges the design itself. The next revelation will explore the deeper psychological tools employed, the way anticipation and rhythm enforce identity, and how these lessons were refined into modern mechanisms of influence that touch every life today. The most insidious lesson of the Plantation is that control does not require force when it is embedded in perception. The women and children were guided, not coerced. Subtle cues, gestures, timing, cadence, light, sound, directed behavior with astonishing precision. The mind, immersed in patterned expectation, obeys instinctively. Resistance becomes cognitively uncomfortable, almost impossible. Compliance feels natural. This is why the synchronized births worked, and why their effects persisted for decades. The body and mind align with the architecture imposed upon them long before awareness emerges. Modern society is an echo of this principle. You live inside invisible scaffolds that shape behavior, choices, and even desire. Education systems, corporate protocols, social norms, and digital algorithms operate as vectors of alignment. Repetition normalizes. Reward reinforces. Social approval channels compliance. Fear is rarely necessary. The most effective control is imperceptible, internalized, and defended by those it governs. The Plantation was the prototype. Today's mechanisms are cleaner, subtler, and embedded in the everyday. Consider anticipation and rhythm. The women's labor was synchronized not only by external factors, but by the internalized timing of their environment. The body responds to cues before the mind can rationalize them. This principle underlies how institutions guide populations. Predictability is achieved by shaping experience before reflection can intervene. Subtle nudges accumulate into behavior patterns that feel natural, even inevitable. Independence becomes constrained within the invisible rails constructed over years. And yet, awareness changes everything. The moment you recognize the architecture, the invisible levers of influence, the systems guiding behavior under the guise of freedom, you gain a rare power, the ability to see beyond orchestration. But knowledge is not neutral. It separates you from the mass of humanity still synchronized. Isolation, doubt, and resistance from others are inevitable. Most will dismiss, ridicule, or unconsciously attempt to pull you back into rhythm. Recognition carries both clarity and danger. The Plantation proves that power's most enduring form is invisible, internalized, and generational. Once embedded, it perpetuates itself quietly, shaping perception, instinct, and identity. What was tested on that single night has rippled through centuries, influencing systems, institutions, and lives today. Understanding this is the first step toward reclaiming agency in a world built to obscure it. The Plantation's experiment reveals that the earliest moments of life are the most vulnerable to influence, and the most powerful when leveraged. Human perception, instinct, and behavior can be calibrated in ways few recognize, long before reasoning or choice develops. The women were guided subtly, the children observed minutely, and the night of synchronized births became a demonstration of what can be achieved when the mind and body are conditioned in concert. This principle is terrifying because it implies that autonomy is often a product of environment, not innate freedom. Consider how invisible cues shape thought. The rhythm of sound, the cadence of speech, the timing of light and shadow, all communicate subtle expectations. Repetition turns suggestion into instinct. When applied over years, the results are predictable. Those born under such influence develop internal frameworks that feel natural, but were externally imposed. The plantation proves that identity can be molded through timing, perception, and psychological alignment. And once identity is shaped, the individual becomes a participant in the system's perpetuation. This is the key insight modern institutions exploit. Obedience is no longer enforced by chains, authority, or direct coercion. It is embedded in structures, in norms, in social reward and punishment. Compliance feels voluntary. Deviation is subtly penalized. Expectation guides thought before reasoning can intervene. The plantation was the first successful application of this model, showing that the human mind can be synchronized, conditioned, and aligned without overt compulsion. And the effect is generational. Children raised under calibrated conditions inherit patterns of perception and response that predispose them to compliance. Authority becomes familiar. Obedience feels natural. Resistance appears irrational. Those who understand this quietly reinforce the system, often without realizing it, perpetuating alignment across decades. The plantation demonstrates that control is not only achieved through action, it is inherited, absorbed, and defended from within. Now, as you process this, reflect on your own life. Consider how early experiences, social cues, and cultural expectations may have aligned your thoughts, desires, and fears in ways you never questioned. Recognition is your first tool of liberation, but it is also a dangerous one. The next revelations will explore how synchronization extends beyond the individual, shaping networks, institutions, and societies in ways most people never perceive. The architecture of control revealed by the plantation operates silently, yet it is pervasive. It is not maintained through overt force but through alignment of perception, expectation, and instinct. The women and children were never forced in the conventional sense. They were guided, primed, and synchronized. The night of births became the apex of years of subtle orchestration, proving that behavior can be directed without visible constraint. The principle is simple but terrifying. When timing, environment, and suggestion converge, obedience becomes automatic. Modern systems borrow the same framework. Social norms, educational structures, corporate hierarchies, and digital environments all use repeated cues, patterned experiences, and structured incentives to shape decisions and desires. Freedom is often an illusion because the environment itself guides action. Subtle reinforcement encourages predictable behavior, while deviation is discouraged indirectly through social pressure, exclusion, or self-doubt. The plantation's experiment was the prototype, showing that control need not be imposed openly. It can be absorbed. Even more unsettling is the generational reach. Children raised within patterned environments internalize compliance, instinctively reproducing the behaviors and hierarchies that were instilled. Authority feels natural, hierarchy feels justified, and rebellion feels alien. This is why the plantation worked. Synchronization at birth established lifelong alignment. The system does not rely on punishment. It relies on calibration, rhythm, and expectation. And this principle has been quietly replicated in society ever since. The most dangerous insight is that those under influence often defend the system. Obedience is internalized, not imposed. Individuals become unwitting participants, perpetuating the structures that guide them. Patterns installed early ripple outward, affecting communities, institutions, and networks. Once the architecture is internalized, it requires no enforcement. Compliance becomes instinct, and resistance becomes psychologically costly. Now, pause and consider this. The patterns you follow, the impulses you obey, the norms you accept, they are not always organic. Many are inherited from systems designed to synchronize behavior generations before you existed. Recognition of this fact is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy. Understanding the plantation is not just history. It is a lens to see how power continues to operate invisibly around you, shaping lives, thoughts, and desires with terrifying precision. The plantation's experiment demonstrates a truth most people refuse to acknowledge. Power does not need to be violent to be absolute. Subtlety is more effective than force. By shaping perception and expectation, the overseers produced obedience without overt coercion. The synchronized births were not an anomaly. They were the product of years of carefully orchestrated rhythms, emotional manipulation, and environmental conditioning. The women and children appeared free, yet every impulse, every response, every heartbeat that night was guided. Compliance became instinctive. This principle scales. Modern institutions, corporations, governments, and social networks operate on the same logic. Timing, repetition, cues, and expectation all align human behavior with desired outcomes. Rewards, sanctions, and social pressure act as invisible reinforcements. Freedom remains apparent, but the system channels choices, decisions, and beliefs along predictable paths. The Plantation's lesson was simple but chilling. Control embedded in perception is far stronger than control enforced by chains. Even rebellion can be neutralized. Those who resist are often quietly redirected, marginalized, or socially isolated. The system does not need to crush them openly. It merely channels behavior toward predictability. Deviance becomes psychologically costly, often internalized as guilt, fear, or self-doubt. The children of the Plantation were the first proof. Those who internalized rhythm and expectation became compliant adults, and those who did not were quietly removed or redirected. The principle is self-perpetuating. Recognition changes the stakes. Awareness of these structures is the first act of liberation, but also a source of danger. Once you see the invisible levers operating in your own life, in schools, workplaces, social networks, and media, you cannot pretend ignorance. You begin to understand that much of what you believe to be choice is actually alignment with a system designed for predictability. The weight of this knowledge is deliberate. Insight separates you from the synchronized masses, creating both clarity and isolation. At this point, you must engage. If you have understood the lesson, type "I am awake" in the comments, twice. This is not mere ritual. It signals recognition, affirmation, and participation in the awakening of insight. The act anchors awareness and begins the process of reclaiming agency from systems built to obscure it. The descent deepens still. What follows will explore the psychological architecture of loyalty, obedience, and hierarchy, the invisible chains that extend from the Plantation into every modern institution you encounter. The Plantation's brilliance was in its subtlety. It relied on rhythm, repetition, and anticipation rather than punishment. Every detail, the timing of meals, the cadence of instruction, even the ambient sound of the environment, was calibrated to produce predictable responses. The women did not labor under threat. They labored because expectation had been internalized. The children did not comply because of oversight. They complied because instinct had been guided from birth. The system proved that the human mind, when immersed in patterned influence, becomes its own enforcer. Modern society mirrors this principle on a vastly larger scale. Schools, workplaces, social networks, and government systems all employ reinforcement, expectation, and subtle cues to align behavior. Compliance is internalized. Rebellion is psychologically expensive. Freedom feels natural, but it operates within boundaries carefully designed by invisible architects. The Plantation was the prototype. Today, the architecture is diffused, subtle, and omnipresent. The patterns remain, just as effective, just as invisible. The children born that night were microcosms of this method, alignment from the earliest moment. Their instincts, desires, and attention were shaped to reinforce hierarchy and obedience. Deviance was quietly corrected, rewarded compliance subtly reinforced. Over time, they embodied the principle that identity can be guided, not imposed. Authority felt natural. Hierarchy felt inevitable. Resistance felt foreign. This is how systems perpetuate themselves across generations, quietly, invisibly, without overt violence. You must understand the personal implication. Many of your habits, decisions, and beliefs may be echoes of similar influences. Environments, social cues, and early experiences shape perception in ways often unnoticed. Once recognized, this realization is destabilizing. The structures that appear natural may in fact be deliberate. Awareness is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy, but it also comes with weight, the weight of seeing the invisible levers guiding lives. From this point, the journey deepens into the mechanics of loyalty and hierarchy, how anticipation, reinforcement, and expectation shape not just behavior, but identity itself. Understanding these forces is essential to perceive the true extent of influence that began on that plantation and continues in invisible ways to this very day. The plantation's control extended beyond behavior. It shaped identity. Obedience was only the surface. The deeper power lay in conditioning perception, emotion, and expectation. The women and children were guided into roles so subtly that resistance felt unnatural. Every cue, every signal, every rhythm reinforced alignment with the system. Over time, they internalized the hierarchy, defending it instinctively. This is the ultimate form of control, when people perpetuate the system themselves, believing it is natural, moral, or inevitable. Modern institutions replicate this principle at scale. Schools, workplaces, religious organizations, and digital platforms reinforce norms that align with systemic goals. Rewards, recognition, and social approval channel behavior. Deviance triggers isolation, doubt, or self-correction. Freedom remains apparent, yet the architecture shapes decisions long before conscious choice is possible. The plantation was the first clear proof that identity itself could be molded. Obedience is simply the first observable consequence. Even those who resist are quietly neutralized. Deviants are redirected, marginalized, or subtly punished. This ensures that the system's patterns remain stable. Compliance becomes self-perpetuating. Children become adults who reinforce the hierarchy, who transmit the patterns to the next generation. Over decades, this creates entire populations predisposed to align instinctively with authority. The lesson is clear. Subtlety is stronger than force. Perception is more powerful than coercion. Awareness changes everything. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward reclaiming agency. Once you see the invisible cues, the rhythms, the expectations that have guided you, you cannot ignore them. The system will resist recognition. Most people will unconsciously attempt to pull you back into the synchronized flow. Insight isolates you, but it also empowers. It reveals the hidden scaffolding of influence that shapes thought, desire, and identity across generations. Now, consider this carefully. The plantation was more than history. It was a blueprint, and its principles continue, embedded in modern structures that shape society. Understanding these forces is not optional. It is survival, psychological, intellectual, and moral. The next section will explore how the lessons of synchronization and perception have been refined into mechanisms of loyalty, influence, and power that govern today's institutions invisibly yet relentlessly. The plantation taught its architects an immutable truth. Loyalty and compliance are not products of fear. They are products of anticipation, expectation, and identity alignment. The women and children of that night did not obey because they were threatened. They obeyed because the rhythms, cues, and subtle reinforcements made compliance feel inevitable. Resistance felt unnatural, even wrong. This is the lesson that has quietly guided human organization ever since. Shape perception first, and behavior will follow almost automatically. Modern systems perfected this principle. Corporations, governments, and educational institutions rely less on overt authority than on subtle cues and calibrated incentives. Social norms, metrics, and feedback loops align behavior in ways that appear voluntary but are preordained by design. Obedience becomes a habit, loyalty becomes instinct, and deviation triggers psychological cost without visible enforcement. The plantation proved this on a small scale. Today, the architecture operates globally, invisible and self-perpetuating. Consider anticipation. It is the invisible lever of influence. When humans expect certain outcomes, the decisions can form in advance. Timing, repetition, and rhythm are tools that align instinct with expectation. The synchronized birth night was a pure demonstration of this principle. The women's bodies, their minds, their perception, all calibrated to peak simultaneously. The lesson is chilling because it shows that autonomy can be preemptively guided, and when done correctly, compliance becomes instinct. Even identity can be shaped this way. Children absorb patterns of perception that made hierarchy feel natural and authority appear inevitable. They defended the very structures that constrained them. This is the ultimate insight. Power need not be visible to endure. It embeds itself in perception, expectation, and rhythm, producing voluntary perpetuation. Resistance, when it occurs, is treated as deviation to be corrected subtly, quietly, and invisibly. You, listening now, are part of similar systems. Your instincts, habits, and assumptions have been guided, nudged, and aligned since birth. Recognition is the first act of liberation, but it is dangerous. Once you see the hidden levers, you cannot return to ignorance. Awareness is both a weapon and a burden, separating you from those still synchronized, exposing the invisible architecture that governs thought, desire, and loyalty. The plantation's silent mastery was psychological, not physical. Its architects understood that fear is temporary, but expectation is permanent. By controlling rhythms, timing, and subtle cues, they produced obedience without visible chains. The women and children believed they were free, yet every heartbeat, every decision, every instinct was guided. Compliance became reflexive. Identity itself was molded to serve the system. This principle is terrifying because it is replicable, scalable, and invisible. Once internalized, the individual perpetuates the system willingly. Modern institutions operate on the same blueprint. Hierarchy, loyalty, and conformity are maintained not through punishment, but through reinforcement, social expectation, and subtle psychological pressure. Rewards and approval guide behavior. Isolation and shame correct deviations. People internalize authority, defend the system, and transmit its rhythms to the next generation. The plantation proved that patterns installed early can produce alignment for life. Today, the same mechanisms operate across society, quietly shaping thought and action on a massive scale. Even curiosity, one of humanity's most dangerous traits, is guided. It is allowed only within permitted boundaries, monitored subtly, corrected with soft reinforcement. Those who explore too freely are quietly neutralized, redirected, or absorbed into predictability. The plantation taught that shaping perception and expectation is more potent than any visible chain. Control embedded in instinct endures. Compliance becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Recognition is the turning point. Once you see the patterns, the cues, the rhythms, the subtle pressures, you gain insight that most never access. But it is isolating. The system will resist, directly or indirectly, through habit, expectation, and social pressure. Awareness separates the observer from the synchronized masses. It reveals the architecture of influence hidden in plain sight, the mechanisms that guide decisions, align desire, and enforce loyalty without overt compulsion. The next stage will explore how these lessons evolved into societal instruments that extend beyond individual obedience, shaping entire communities, networks, and institutions with precision, invisibility, and generational durability. The plantation's principles, once learned, became a template for enduring power that persists to this day. The plantation was not an isolated experiment. It was a blueprint. Its lessons were replicated and refined in subtle ways across society. Timing, expectation, and rhythm became tools of influence far beyond its fields. Education systems adopted structured routines to produce predictable minds. Corporations implemented hierarchies and reward systems that guided behavior subtly. Governments relied on rituals, schedules, and norms to align populations. The principle was simple: influence perception first, behavior will follow. Compliance feels natural. Resistance feels foreign. What makes this system terrifying is its invisibility. The women and children believed they were acting freely. The synchronized birth night was perceived as extraordinary, even miraculous, but it was engineered. Every cue, every rhythm, every repetition was orchestrated. Modern institutions use the same principle, often without conscious awareness. Norms, expectations, incentives, and social reinforcement guide behavior long before conscious reasoning intervenes. Choice is real, but constrained, preconditioned, and heavily influenced by invisible forces. The plantation also teaches a deeper psychological lesson: identity is malleable. The children internalized the rhythms imposed upon them, shaping their instincts, perception, and loyalty. They became voluntary perpetuators of the system that guided them. Resistance was psychologically costly. Over generations, patterns of perception and behavior stabilized. Hierarchies felt natural. Authority appeared inevitable. The result is a population aligned not through overt coercion,